Today's story begins in the ever-increasingly distant past, several years before the first set of Magic the Gathering ever released, before the game would explode in popularity and create a massive demand for cards that nobody had been prepared for, before the first ever expansion of the game, and before we could see the true storyline of the game unfold. A different game was pitched to Wizards of the Coast, a company which was brand new at the time. This game was known as Robo Rally. Designed in 1985, Robo Rally, unsurprisingly, centered around robots, where players would control them to pass through a series of checkpoints, racing against the other players in order to be the first one to do so. This game was too costly for Wizards of the Coast to produce at the time, so they instead asked for a game that required fewer pieces in order to be played. This course of events is what will ultimately create Magic the Gathering as we know it today. Magic was designed by Richard Garfield, who was heralded as the creator of one of, if not the most, successful trading card games ever created. In the early years, Garfield had a very small team of people designing cards, and he served as the lead for the very first expansions of the game. As time progressed, his involvement in development of new sets became less and less. Though his involvement in the game is not the same as it once was, he has helped to design some of the most iconic sets from the more modern era of Magic, being Ravnica City of Guilds and Innistrad. Despite the fact that he no longer spearheads the game, he is still synonymous with it, being that he is one of its original creators, producing a game that so far has managed to withstand the test of time. Because the game has been around for nearly 30 years, there are a number of tales about Richard Garfield in the early days of Magic the Gathering, and I'd like to talk to you today about some of these stories and tell you about the creation of Magic the Gathering. Magic isn't really one singular idea, but rather the product of several ideas put together. One of Garfield's earliest prototype games was known as 5 Magics. He combined the idea of collectible cards with a playable game, and this idea was pitched to Wizards of the Coast, becoming known as Mana Clash. Now, Mana Clash was not their original name when creating the game, as during playtesting the game had been known simply as Magic. Speaking of playtest, let's take a look at some of these playtest cards. Right away, I think one thing that stands out is the mana cost on a lot of these cards. Take Destroy Artifact for example, which is better known as the card Shatter. The mana cost appears to be 2 and a red, which is a significant difference from the casting cost of 1 and a red on the original alpha release. Another example is Minotaur, which again is just the card Heirloom Minotaur, also has a more expensive casting cost. Now these cards appear to possess a higher casting cost, but that isn't actually the case. The confusion stems from the way that mana costs were displayed during playtesting. Instead of being split by how much of each mana you had to pay, the cards instead tried to tell you how much total mana you had to spend and how much of that mana had to be colored. This explanation is a little weird, so let me try to visualize it. Serra Angel has a mana cost of 5 white. But what that really means is that of the 5 mana you need to cast the spell, 2 of it has to be white. It's not overly convoluted, but it's confusing enough for new players that it just makes sense to print the cards by saying that it costs 2 white mana and 3 mana of any kind. This system gets especially weird on artifact cards, which use the mana cost section to explain both how much the card costs, as well as how much mana is necessary to use its ability, if any. This has the bonus effect of also making it seem like any artifact creature has 2 separate power and toughness stats. It's almost surreal to see the cards look like this, especially when comparing them to their actual counterparts. One card that underwent a lot of changes is Time Walk. In initial playtesting, Time Walk actually started as this red card Starburst. Due to the confusing wording, it had been interpreted as causing your opponent to lose at the end of their next turn, rather than having your opponent skip their next turn. In order to clarify what the card actually did, it was reworded to have the caster take an extra turn after the current one, and was moved to blue as a result. On the website I found that lists all these Gamma Test cards, Starburst was listed as a common, and to think of a world where Time Walk was common is truly terrifying. Fun fact, according to the same site, the first ever game of Magic was played between Richard Garfield and Barry Reich. Garfield did not win the game. How did we get here? Oh right, they were going to name the game Mana Clash. So the game had been called Magic during playtesting, and so they really wanted to name the game Magic. The problem was that their lawyer told them that they wouldn't be able to trademark the word Magic as it was too broad. They would need to add something to the name of the game in order to make it more unique and recognizable, giving us the name Magic the Gathering. I also learned that this subtitle of The Gathering was originally planned to change as new sets came out. Of course, repeatedly filing trademarks and changing the name of your game could be a little difficult and confusing, so this never came to fruition, which I'm thankful for, because the name Magic Kamigawa Neon Dynasty would be quite the mouthful. While we're looking at the back of the card, I'd like to talk a little bit about this single word that has sat on the back of the card since the game's release, Deckmaster. Originally, Magic was the first in a line of games all bearing the Deckmaster title. Some of these others included Netrunner, based on the Cyberpunk 2020 RPG, Vampire: The Eternal Struggle, and Battletech. None of these games were quite as successful as Magic, and so ultimately Deckmaster serves as a remnant of the past on the backs of Magic cards to this day. But, of course, the decision to leave this term on the back of the card hasn't been without debate, as Mark Rosewater has stated that the discussion of changing the back of the card comes up every so often, the justification being that most players already play with sleeves, so the ramifications of doing so are pretty minuscule in the long term. Magic Arena has already tried to do a version of this, thanks to the ability to change card backs to whatever they want, and so we actually have a version of the card back for a more modern time. This back has also seen print on some of the extremely oversized cards given out for things like the Legacy and Vintage Championships. I have one last anecdote about the back of the Magic card, and then I swear we'll get back to the timeline of the game. When the set Arabian Nights was about to be released, the plan was for it to feature its own special card back, which would be separate from the original core series of cards, as the set was designed for standalone play. However, this was ultimately changed at the last minute, and this can be seen in two ways. The first is that one mountain still ended up on the print sheet, and made it the only basic land you could pull from an Arabian Nights pack. The second is that you can actually see the card back printed on boxes of Arabian Nights, so this was clearly a pretty late decision. We've gotten pretty far off topic, so I'd like to circle back to the very beginning of the game, when Alpha had just released, and many players didn't fully understand the rules, due in part to learning the game from a friend, who might have learned the rules from their friend, and so on. Does Llanowar Elves fetch a forest from your deck? Maybe. Does Dark Ritual tap for 3 black mana? It might. Players also had the desire to create their own cards for the game, which could be featured in Scry magazine. Of course, getting people to allow you to play with these altars is another story altogether, with one notable exception. There was a common house rule that if you had altered a Magic card, and then had that Magic card signed by Richard Garfield, then it could be played exactly as it was written. Scrolling through these, it's pretty interesting to see the designs early Magic players came up with. Some of these are genuine attempts at cards. Fear of Life is something that actually seems like it could be a real card, but it pales in comparison to this altered version of Chaos Orb. This card must be flipped from a height of at least 2 inches, feet, miles, no clue. But whatever it touches must be ripped up. Now, you likely never actually get to do that, because it's more likely that your opponent concedes, rather than letting you actually get to physically destroy one of their cards. Of course, this is in reference to the popular Magic myth surrounding Chaos Orb. The story goes that a player activated Chaos Orb, ripped it into pieces, and then threw those pieces at his opponent's board in order to destroy everything on it. This story is specifically referenced in Magic's first ever silver-bordered set, Unglued, on the card Chaos Confetti. The flavor text for the card reads, "And you thought that was just an urban myth." While we're on the subject of unsets, I'd like to take a minute to talk about my favorite card in any unset. That card is Richard Garfield PhD. The rules text of this card pays homage to the very altars that we've been talking about, allowing you to play Magic cards as though they were other Magic cards with the same mana cost. The catch is that you can't choose the same card twice, meaning it's important that you keep track of the cards you've played. The rulings for this card refer to this as a subgame called Mental Magic. Mental Magic is perhaps one of the greatest tests of game knowledge, unless you're willing to perform a search for every card that shares a mana cost with whatever spell is in your hand. To bring this story full circle, the foil card also features the signature of Richard Garfield, which was the very thing that allowed the original altars to be played by the player base. Of course, Richard Garfield himself also designed new and weird experimental cards that he would play against other people, because who wouldn't let the creator of the game play new cards? I think the most prominent example of this comes from Worlds 2008, where in a game against Aaron Forsyth, Richard Garfield played a deck full of playtest cards that were designed to swap cards with your opponent, but not by copying them or stealing them with control magic, at least not entirely. Garfield had designed a deck that took cards from your opponent's hand and swapped them for cards in your hand. He also had cards that swapped in libraries, lands that could swap themselves, as well as a spell that just shuffled gunk into your opponent's deck, which were cards that did absolutely nothing when drawn, effectively stopping your opponent's draw. In what has now become a recurring statement in our story today, Garfield did not win the game, nor did he win the match. The gunk mechanic has made an appearance on a physical, albeit semi-legitimate Magic card. Gunk Slug shuffles 3 Gunk tokens into your opponent's deck, but unlike Garfield's original Gunk card, these Gunk can be cycled for 4 mana, which, while a lot, makes them a little better than a blank draw. In addition to Garfield's playtest deck, Garfield also created cards that celebrated important moments in his life. The first of these cards is Proposal, which was made for Richard Garfield's proposal to Lily Wu. It's worth noting that this isn't the actual art on the card. Due to the personal nature, the art on the card has never been revealed to the public. There are 9 copies of this card in existence, and when Garfield wanted to propose to Lily, he only included 1 copy in the deck he was playing, which resulted in him playing 4 games in order to actually draw the card. The deck they created is reportedly still intact. The remaining copies of the card were given to family members, except 2 copies, one of which was given to Quentin Hoover, the original artist of the card, and the other was given to David Howell, who was the production manager for Magic the Gathering from Alpha up through Revised. Splendid Genesis is the second of these cards to be created, this one celebrating the birth of his first child. Fraternal Exaltation commemorates the birth of his second child, and lastly, Phoenix Heart was created for Garfield's marriage to his second wife, Connie Kim. There are other celebration cards, but they aren't as significant to our story today, so we'll have to look over them another time. While there are only a few cards that commemorate specific moments or people like the ones already mentioned, the early days of the game feature a number of cards that pay homage to people through hiding their name in a Magic card. These are collectively known as vanity cards, and there are quite a few of them. Waiuli Wolf, for instance, is an anagram of Lily Wu. Tellum Tor is an anagram for Mr. Toilet, the unfortunate nickname of Mirage and Vision designer Scott Seagal. Leshrac is an anagram for Charles, a playtester for Wizards of the Coast. If Biff Ifrit is not an anagram, but If Biff was the childhood nickname of Richard Garfield's sister Elizabeth. Richard Garfield's name is also hidden in the game. Feldegriff secretly spells out Garfield PhD, and is seen on both Feldegriff from Alliances, as well as Questing Feldegriff from Planeshift. Vanity cards aren't solely limited to the names of cards, or even to one singular card. Amaro is something we've seen reappear time and time again. Originally coming from an abbreviation of Mark Rosewater's name, Amaro has come to represent a creature that typically has power and toughness equal to the number of cards in hand, sometimes your own hand, occasionally your opponent. The Invitational Winner cards are also considered vanity cards, at least according to Mark Rosewater. Vanity cards are now mostly a relic of the past, as there was concern about influence, and how they can affect decisions that are made, as well as causing ill will among staff. The closest we've come to a vanity card in recent times are the dogs featured in the secret lair Every Dog Has Its Day, which were obtained through a search among employees to find dogs that served as models for the cards. I think we often hear this phrase in Magic, as Richard Garfield intended. Granted, this is typically said as a sarcastic remark, but I think that it begs the question, what is Magic as Richard Garfield intended? Is it the original playtest cards with their interesting wording and moderately confusing mana costs? Is it the more polished versions of these cards printed in Alpha, or the early sets created by Garfield? If this is the case, then why did several of these cards receive power level erratas before being changed back to their original broken state? Given how often the state of the game has changed, since the very beginning, it's hard to say what Richard Garfield's perfect vision of Magic is, but I think no matter that vision, it's impossible to control the game to that degree. How much of what changed could be considered sacrificing his vision of the game in exchange for a streamlined gaming experience? Does that even count as altering his vision? Looking at Starburst again, his vision of the card wasn't to have your opponent die on the next turn, but that was how some of the players had misinterpreted the card to function. But the question extends further than that, because his influence is not limited to just the early days of the game, as he's been credited with helping to design a set as recently as 2018. Ultimately, I think that Magic as Richard Garfield intended is not a static state of experience. The game always has, is always, and will always change, and that's okay. It's important for the game to be able to do that in order for it to keep moving forward. But what do you think? I know I didn't really touch on vanity cards again, but are there any I didn't mention that you find noteworthy? What are your thoughts on invitational cards and whether or not they should be brought back? Let me know in the comments, along with any other stories you think I should talk about in future videos.